Resolution 1373 announced after the September 11 attacks, and these encourage states to create their own blacklists. So in the United Kingdom we have 42 organisations who are listed. This includes Al-Qaeda, but it also includes many organisations involved in long-standing armed conflicts in pursuit of self-determination struggles against repressive regimes. So we see organisations like the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, the LTTE, the Baloch Liberation Army, ETA, and also the Basque Left, the Communist Party of the Philippines, as well as a range of Palestinian actors, including Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hamas, amongst others. So what we're talking about is a fundamentally anti-democratic regime. In the UK, listing is an executive decision. The courts do not make a decision as to whether an organisation qualifies as a terrorist organisation or not, and it's almost impossible to be delisted, as you need to show that an organisation has absolutely no involvement in any armed struggle or any connection to political violence, which is desperately naive in a world which is characterised by unresolved political conflict. So where does the mechanism for criminalisation come from? Well, firstly, it's an offence to have practically any connection, material, political, or even emotional, with a listed organisation. For an example, it's an offence in the United Kingdom to provide funds, even indirectly, and despite the very purpose of the funds. It's also an offence to provide support, to associate with, or to wear and carry any item that could give rise to a reasonable suspicion that you support the organisation. So these briefings give examples of how these offences have been used to threaten or prosecute communities. And so Campacc argues that these offences function to criminalise not only individuals affected, but entire communities who have very legitimate connections to conflicts in country of origin, who fled repression as refugees most often. And so prescription turns communities into what Paddy Hilliard famously termed as suspect communities when he was writing about the effects of the Prevention of Terrorism Act on the Irish community during the Troubles. So we saw only last week 16 Kurdish activists were visited by MI5 and the police and threatened with prescription offences for their open solidarity work in Turkey. While no charges have yet been laid, the effects of these threats are to stop the diaspora from speaking out against repression targeted towards the Kurds. And this reflects a long history of the United Kingdom's harassment of the Kurds since the 1980s. And clearly this repression in Turkey is related to the role of the United Kingdom and the EU. The repression in Turkey over the last year or so has escalated against Kurdish civil society. At the moment, there's a political show trial of 150 pro-Kurdish democracy politicians for so-called connections to the PKK, based on flimsy evidence and basically used in pursuit of political manoeuvring by the ruling AKP party. So you would have hopefully seen an open letter and petition to the Home Office which is circulating about the harassment of the Kurds here and encouraging the UK to engage in productive dialogue to encourage Turkey to open real negotiations with the PKK. So we encourage you to please sign and support that petition. There's also a campaign that's been organised by a coalition of European lawyers to delist the PKK from the EU lists, which will be presented to the European Parliament next year, and they're calling on individual lawyers and lawyers' organisations to sign on to that campaign. So if there are any lawyers in the room or representatives of legal organisations, we encourage you to sign that petition, which is on that table there. We turn to Balochistan in our briefings, where extrajudicial killings, torture and disappearances of the Baloch people by the Pakistani army and intelligence has escalated dramatically over the last few months. The Baloch struggle for independence remains one of the most hidden and unknown conflicts of our time. And the listing of the Baloch Liberation Army by the UK has only furthered this harassment and repression, and it has been used to suppress Baloch activists here, which we will hear more about shortly from our Baloch speaker. And for the Tamils, the prescription laws have been used during the conflict by prosecuting members of the Tamil community in the UK for funding the LTTE for humanitarian purposes. And very ironically, since the defeat of the LTTE last year in the terrible genocidal practices that the Sri Lankan state enabled, Europe is being asked by Sri Lanka to crack down on the Tamil diaspora, who they see as fronts for the LTTE. We're seeing a number of charges and prosecutions which have been laid several months ago in Germany, the Netherlands, Denmark, Italy and Norway. So we see that Sri Lanka is particularly unhappy about how the diaspora have been pursuing the Sri Lankan state for charges of genocide and of war crimes it committed during the conflict and at the end of the war. And for the Basque struggle, we see the entire Basque left being criminalised by the listing of ETA and also the listing of Batasuna, the Basque pro-independence political party, which was banned in 2003 by Spain and then followed suit by the EU. So here we have, I think, one of the first examples of EU including overtly a political party on its list, which through peaceful political means seeks similar political objectives as those pursued by armed organisations. And this has come, we see recently, ETA calling for a ceasefire, yet we've seen the increased use of attempted extraditions across Europe against Batasuna and Basque leftists. So I want to suggest what we've seen in Campacc is there's a clear pattern of criminalisation of these four communities, which I would characterise has four major effects that we can think about and have a discussion about. The first is that prescription turns the efforts of the diaspora in influencing the course of political conflicts, transforms them into terrorism. And it erases the diaspora's experience of genocide, of repression, or of persecution by the countries of origin. So listing, like the UK, furthers this hidden repression through processes of criminalisation here. Secondly, we believe that listing denies the right that non-state actors have in international law to self-defence, in furtherance to the right of self-determination against repressive regimes. And it's important that we recognise that this right only came about because of those struggles for decolonisation. So I think we're finding an environment now that discussions about support for self-determination, politically or through direct or indirect funding, have been closed off through stigmatisation enabled by the terrorism laws, and we're hoping to prise open those spaces. Thirdly, I think a major effect of prescription is that listing is obviously used as a foreign policy tool where repressive states can legitimate their state terror by enlisting the support of Europe and the UK, the US, to basically silence their critics. And these states have become complicit in tacitly approving the repression of self-determination movements. And fourthly, as many others have argued, listing makes conflicts worse by prioritising a counter-terrorism approach of military annihilation rather than conflict resolution, and by labelling non-state actors as terrorists and denies them political status and makes negotiations difficult. So these issues are explored in detail in the briefings and by our speakers. Our aim is that these briefings are circulated in order to speak back to official accounts which erase experiences of state terror. And we hope that they'll be used by NGOs to circulate understanding of the experiences of communities. And importantly, we want to put the case forward and create a platform publicly for challenging the bans, for ways to lift them and to decriminalise migrant communities here. And of course, there are many more than these 4 communities who are affected. For example, the criminalisation of Palestinian self-determination through terrorism laws is one such prominent example. So we will now hear from our 5 speakers. We have apologies from Les Lebedeau from Campacc, who's very ill, from Matt Cook, who was on the agenda, whose family is very ill. And what we'll do is we'll hear from each speaker and we'll take questions and discussions at the end. And then we can have informal discussion over drinks.